Well, Professor Eric Anderson, Professor of Sport at the University of Winchester, is the lead author of this report, and I'm delighted to say joins me now. Morning, Eric.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I know this sounds like quite a provocative issue, and I appreciate your open-mindedness on this. And I'd like to sort of inform you of some of the things that you're slightly uninformed on.
I mean, I should acknowledge that our COVID party liar, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who gets a highly paid column in the Daily Mail, penned 1,000 words on this subject yesterday. Piffle like rugby doesn't risk young people's lives, it can save them. And not once in those 1,000 words, not once did he mention Alzheimer's, motor neurone disease, life-changing injuries. He doesn't even address it, not mentioned. So maybe you can, Eric.
Well, let's be honest here. Boris is really just trying to cover up for the fact that he bowled a 10-year-old child over in front of the media.
Yeah.
Right? So, from now on, whenever a large rugby player hits a small rugby player, we're going to call it a Boris.
He'll probably quite like that. Is it child abuse? So it's an inflammatory thing to say. It gets attention, but I'm mindful of those who went to, say, Catholic schools that were abused back in the day, that they may not take so kindly to such a provocative term.
Well, let's look at some of the statistics, okay? So in our survey of over 200 secondary schools in England, we found that 86% compel boys to play tackle rugby. Compel. They force boys to play tackle rugby. That's a huge finding. And then the idea that rugby has somehow become safer defies the laws of physics. The basics of a tackle is simple. One brain is moving, the other brain is either stopped or moving in opposite direction, and they both stop instantly. And in that moment, the brain sloshes forward, hits the skull, bounces around, and causes a great deal of damage. Now, the larger the hit, the faster the brain stops, the more damage there is. So children throughout this country are being forced to engage in an activity upon which both the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control say is a cause and effect relationship with a variety of motor degenerative diseases, including a very virulent form of dementia known as CTE, which hits earlier, which hits harder, which leads to suicide, depression, violence against women. And it is exactly the reason that 300 former rugby players in this, quote, very safe sport, according to Boris Johnson, are suing the Rugby Football Union and World Rugby for dereliction of duty to inform them with proper consent.
From what I've seen of press accounts of your imminent report, there is this notion that parents aren't aware of the dangers. I suggest we might need to go further and just say, would you suggest the authorities have got their heads in the sand? Because the NFL in America, without accepting liability, I should stress that, came to a settlement with American football players. It was nearly $1 billion, about $760 million, I think, something like that, to care for injured professional players as their brain injuries come to fruition. That seems to me to be a very powerful thing that we should consider in this country, and yet I hear precious little about it.
Well, let's look at a few facts here. First of all, the NFL's lawsuit has far exceeded $1 billion. They've now paid out $1.2 billion, and they've denied another $800 million in benefits to players, particularly black players. So it's a real problem. But in America, children are not forced to play football in school systems. In England, of course, they are. Rugby is also 4 times more concussive than American football because the players are on the field. Yeah, let's face it, they're proper athletes in rugby. They're on the field for 80 minutes. In American football, there's 12 minutes of play in total, and there's an offense and a defense. So we are setting our culture up. We are setting a generation up for serious problems that mostly affect the male population, and we are blind eye against it. So your question is, does Parliament have responsibility here? Absolutely. In fact, they've begun to realize that they're letting the fox rule the hen house. We cannot let the Rugby Football Union or other organizations that control sport like boxing tell us how safe their sports are because they have vested interest into, well, let's just say not
okay,
so long.
So to Boris Johnson, the main thrust of his article, which is clearly not to address the science, is that our children face a multitude of problems in their life, that sedentary lifestyles, the various distractions we have mean that they're not living as healthily as they used to, and that getting out on the field and running around and getting involved in team games is just the answer. Now, I'm mindful of what you've said about the schools that you're aware of that are forcing children to play tackle rugby. One of my colleagues, a female, had rugby at her school, and she said that throughout her school career it was non-contact rugby. Ironically, some of the young women actually felt that they were missing out, that they wanted to play proper rugby. Is it just a sort of way of conclusion? Really, is there a middle way here that if schools were to genuinely have non-contact rugby all the way through till 18, it may not prepare England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland with the great rugby players of the future, but it would keep our children safe and get them exercising. Is that the way to go?
Jeremy, you're exactly right. Not only is there an alternative available, tag rugby, touch rugby, ripper rugby, whatever you want to call it, but it's growing rapidly because parents are pulling their children out of the tackle form of the game. Now, what I've heard from the Rugby Football Union over the years is, well, then they won't learn to tackle properly when they make it to higher levels. But of course, only 1 in 1,000 children matriculate up to that level. And by the time they get to the professional level, it's what, 1 in 100,000? So our argument is simple. You're right. Children need to be outdoors. They need to be moving. They don't need to be tackling. And in fact, if they play touch, it's a faster game. The heart stays elevated for longer periods of time. And there is, Boris Johnson, absolutely no health benefits to tackling whatsoever. So when he says tackling is safe and that it saves lives, I can put him in touch with parents who have lost their children's lives to head trauma.
Okay, I mean, that is very serious. There's one other aspect to Boris. And last question, I promise. One aspect to Boris Johnson's opinion piece, which I am more open to, and that is risk. That I have a 5-year-old. She sometimes wears a helmet on her scooter, rarely on her bike. I didn't even know cycle helmets existed when I was there, and I'm sure they have a positive role to play. But I know that when I'm on a motorbike, when I wear a full face helmet, I ride more quickly than when I wear an open face. There's different psychological impacts on safety, but risk itself. I think Boris Johnson has this perception that people like yourself, academics, are trying to eradicate risk and keep our children safe to the sort of nth degree. And in doing so, the implication is that you may be harming those children by keeping them safe.
Yes, of course, Boris has yet another uninformed opinion.
He's got a lot of kids. He's got a lot of kids, so enough to field a 7-a-side rugby team. So he's got.
So let's look at, the RFU talks about safety. They want to make it a safer sport. They're constantly thriving to make it safer. That defies the laws of physics. You can't save a brain from smashing into another child. Helmets do nothing. In fact,
make it worse.
Helmets make it worse. Absolutely. Helmets will stop an abrasion and they'll stop a fracture, but they don't stop the brain from hitting the inside of the skull. So helmets are not the answer here in any way, shape, or form. There is no way, it's not within the laws of physics to mitigate the risks of one brain smashing into something stationary.
Professor Eric Anderson, very, very interesting talking to you. Thank you for that.